I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture. Hi, everyone. We are here with a very exciting episode talking about our top books of 2023. Reading and the love of books is something that Lucy and I have in common. And when I first met Lucy, one of the ways that she was introduced is being an avid reader that reads over 50 books a year. And I was so excited to chat with you back then about your books. And now it's so exciting to have a whole podcast episode dedicated just to our reading tastes.
When we were thinking about what would be a fun way to close out the year, even though we've yet to actually release anything, we have recorded, I think this is our 8th episode.
Wow.
I know. So
we are so
impressive.
Prolific for being unpublished.
I know. We're just talking to ourselves in a room alone.
The void.
And also, yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you about your favorite books this year. Maybe we should start by just clarifying what our criteria is. One, I guess when we're saying this year, we're not saying that the books had to be published this year.
These are specifically read in 2023, not published.
Yeah. Okay. So what's kind of your criteria for listing a book as among your favorites?
So I have two separate groupings of favorite books. For both criteria, it has to have staying power. Like I need to be thinking about it after I finished, which sometimes a book is super entertaining and I blow through it in a day or two and I never think about it again. And that's not a 5-star book to me. So a 5 stars, it's entertaining and has staying power. And then my second really top tier list is it moved me in some way. And like I cried. Like a lot of my 5-star books, I cried or it like fundamentally changed my perspective of the world in some way.
Okay. That's a high bar.
Yeah, it's a very high bar.
Change your perspective. Yeah, it's super interesting.
How do you think of your tops?
Yeah, it's similar. The types of books that I'm drawn to tend to be ones where the actual setting or maybe what's overtly being discussed in the book is not actually super interesting. I like books that are about everyday life, everyday situations, everyday people. And then what holds the reader's attention is really the complex inner lives of those characters. I think it's like fascinating to read about characters who have this really vast interiority. And through those reflections, the book says something profound about the meaning of life. So I would say that's definitely a factor. I think another piece I do really appreciate is when the writing is just really beautiful. Yeah. Like I studied English and studied writing, so I feel like when I just see like beautiful sentences, it does definitely make a book memorable for me. And then the third I would say is surprise. Since I do read a lot and I've read a lot since I was a kid. I mean, now I guess my taste is more quote unquote highbrow, but definitely as a kid, I read a lot of YA, read everything, consumed a lot of TV and movies and media. I feel like in general, when I watch TV and movies, I can anticipate the ending. Even plot twists, I'm often not surprised. So now when I like think about books that I read, if it can actually surprise me, that's automatically a winner.
Well, I'm curious if we can go on a side tangent right now. Like why, as somebody who reads a lot of books, why aren't you on the internet of books? It seems like it would be right up your alley because you don't do any book tracking. You don't have a Goodreads profile. I've tried to bully you into getting a Goodreads profile because I want to stalk what you're reading. You're like, can I not? Thanks.
Well, I think for me, reading, I mean, okay, so when I was a kid, I would go to the library every week and check out 7 books and like be done with those 7 books. Like I was reading a book a day when I was in middle school. These were like YA books, right? So they were quick and easy to get through. But it was always a very private activity. Like I never told my friends what I was reading. It's not like I was proud of what I was reading necessarily or like really identified it with it. It was more just pure entertainment value. And so I think that the Goodreads community has always seemed like people who read a bit to also like share it socially, right? Because it's a whole social platform. And I totally get that if you get your recommendations from your friends and you want to know what your friends are reading. But that's just never been my process. Like even from being a kid and going to the library every week, I would just look at what's on the shelf and whatever covers jumped out and whatever back pages seemed interesting. Like that's how I would read my books. And I really had no sense of what was actually popular or not. Like a lot of times I was making my own judgments when it came to that. Now it's different because like, you know, obviously a bookstore is like much more curated. Like a library, it's just alphabetical. Yeah. But a bookstore, someone is informing your taste. So I'm by no means saying I'm a tastemaker. I definitely follow the trends and like I know and recognize what's popular because I see the same book titles over and over and I'll read those.
No, I totally relate to what you're saying with it being a private activity. And I was the same way growing up. I read all the time too. And it was pre-internet, but also like you're a teenager or preteen. And so you're not on the internet reviewing these things. So it's like very much whatever you stumble upon. And it feels like Like I heard somebody say that they miss the times when like you stumble into the library or a bookstore and you don't know anything about the books that you're seeing. And it's like each book holds its own world and you have no idea what it is until you crack open the first page. And I remember that feeling so viscerally from being in like a Barnes and Noble as a preteen. And that feeling has totally gone away because I'm on the internet now. I basically know what's happening with every single book before I even crack open the spine. I can look at a title and be like, I already know what 5 people think about this book. And so this year I've actually challenged myself in 2023 to pick up books that I know absolutely nothing about at my local indie bookstore. And I do miss that feeling. And I know exactly what you're talking about. I actually started a new Goodreads profile because I've been on Goodreads for a very long time, like probably a decade. And so I started a new Goodreads profile last year where I didn't socially connect with anybody. And then I actually started making connections with people just from the reviews I was making. So I would make a snarky review of a book I didn't like, and then someone would just add me as a friend. And like now I've gotten to like kind of weirdly know them over Goodreads. I have no idea who this person is.
Wow, that's cool. Kind of like a book club, but I feel like book clubs, it's like, okay, people who are your kind of friends or acquaintances, but you don't necessarily share the same taste in books. But then what you're describing is like people who actually like really appreciate your specific take on books, probably have similar taste to you, and then you don't actually know who they are in real life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because one of the girls who like we randomly followed each other just from seeing the same bad take on a book, she only has like 30 friends on Goodreads, and one of those friends is a mutual of mine on my TikTok.
Oh, wow, look at you.
That I actually interact with quite a bit. So I'm like, the world is so small.
I know. We talk about like community a lot on the podcast, and I feel like you have done an amazing job of creating your like digital book community. Like you have a book club in Nashville too. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's been super fun. I actually was like had a very vulnerable moment with one of the few friends that I met IRL here in Nashville. And I was like, I want more good girlfriends. And I feel like since moving out of New York, I haven't really built that community. And I've always wanted to do a book club, and I'm going to like do something really risky. I'm going to like text these random group of girls and see if they'll join this book club. So like heart my message right away once I send it. And everyone was laughing at me. They're like, it'll be fine. People will want to join. And they did. There were like 15 people that joined the book club immediately. And it's been like a really cute little community. It's out of my comfort zone for sure. This is like not something I'm really good at, but the book community for me this year has been great. And I only stumbled into it because I am an aspiring author. And now more than ever, you really need to have a platform as an author to get published. And so I was like, shit, I need to put myself out there. And I'm so glad I did. It was very, very scary at first, especially when I like posted my first video on TikTok and I had 0 followers. And I'm just like watching the numbers come in, be like, oh, I got my first follower. Like I have my first 2 likes. And it's like so fucking embarrassing the first like few months that you have a public profile page and you have like 40 followers. And you're like, who do I think I am? Being like, this is what I think. And just shouting it to the void. It was mortifying, but I had to get over the cringe of my own self.
Your videos are so professional and impressive, though. Everyone should just seriously check her out. You want to promote it? What's your book talk handle?
At Jens.pages, Jens Pages. Check me out on TikTok.
Cute. It's so cute.
I would actually love to start off this combo by talking about the world's top 10 picks this year. So I always find it super interesting how what I consider serious book people, like the New York Times and these major lists, always have such different top 10 lists than what the people are actually reading. Like the Goodreads Choice Awards and like the Goodreads Most Shelved lists, which are just crowdsourced. They're so vastly different. Most shelved on Goodreads, I think is actually very reflective of what I've been seeing on the social book internet as well. Of course, the book of the year is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Lucy, what do you know about this one?
I mean, okay, so I haven't read it. I've seen it everywhere. Is it like dragons? Is it like sexy dragons? Why do I think it's like boarding school and sexy dragons?
You hit the nail on the head. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's like if Divergent and Hunger Games and like a little bit of erotica had a baby, it'd be fun.
Okay. All right. Spicy. Okay. I mean, see that I get it. Like that's what appeals to people. Have you read it?
I did. This was the first book club pick for my Nashville book club. So we wanted to do something that was going to be a sure hit. And I was intrigued. So I was seeing this book everywhere. And I've been trying to get into fantasy because, again, that like lit fic sensibility, don't really get into a lot of genre fiction and was not to my taste personally, but I did have a good time with it. I was like, I had to set my like pretentious asshole self aside and be like, just go along for the ride and have fun with it.
Okay, so it seems like most of this top 10 on Goodreads are like a lot of fantasy, some romance. I mean, that's what you hear, right? In terms of bestsellers, it's often romance books or fantasy books. And then if we look at the 10 quote unquote best books of the year, according to the New York Times, these are all literary fiction books, right? So we've got The Bee Sting, Chain Gang All Stars, Eastbound, The Fraud by Zadie Smith, Northwoods. I feel like I've seen a lot of these titles in bookstores.
Some of these I don't even recognize, and I feel bad
some
about
of the
that.
bottom ones. I'm Fireweather by John Valiant. Never heard of that.
No. Some People Need Killing by Patricia Evangelista. I've never heard of that one.
Are you going to put any of these on your want to read? How do you decide what to add to your list?
I think I'm going to put The Bee Sting. I've just heard so much about that one. I am interested in reading Chain Gang All Stars, but I feel like that's one that's just like been shoved in my face so much. And I think that's why I want to read it. Not that I'm like naturally inclined to do so. One of my book resolutions for the new year is to not just read a book because it's in my face, because I did a lot of that this year. And I didn't enjoy most of them. So
yeah,
I want to get back to that like kid wandering in the library that we were talking about and just pick up random things.
Right. We are planning, we haven't even launched our podcast as of today, December 27th, when we're recording this, but we are going to have a Patreon. One of the tiers is going to have book club access where we'll pick a book every month and have folks read with us. And then maybe we'll get on a Zoom call or like some sort of forum where we can all like chat together. I think that'd be really fun.
I think that would be so fun. Yeah, we should definitely do that. If nothing else, we will definitely have a full episode chatting about it, doing some analysis, but having a little happy hour book club, everyone bring a little glass of wine and read the book. I think it'd be great.
So cute. Amazing. All right. Well, let's get into some other of our faves and maybe reader recommendations.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me what your 3 best books of the year were.
The first one is Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano. This was the first book I've read of hers, but since reading this book, I've also now read Dear Edward because I really liked her writing style. Have you read this book, Jennifer?
No, I just bought it off of Pango Books, though.
I'm excited to hear what you think after, but Hello Beautiful is about like a normal family who lives in the suburbs of Chicago. It's like a homage to Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And the main characters are this boy named William Waters who grew up in this like really cold household where because of a tragedy that happened before he was born, his parents did not pay him any attention, did not love him growing up. And so he grew up largely alone. And then in college, he meets this girl named Julia, and she comes from this family of 3 other sisters. The 3 sisters, I feel like each are a different portrait of womanhood. Julia is really like ambitious, super clear-eyed about what she wants out of her life, hungry, strong. Sylvie, who is the next youngest, is super empathetic. She is a librarian and loves books and has always dreamed about having like her one true love. And then you've got the 2 youngest who are twins, and one of them is Cecilia, this free-spirited artist, and then the other, Emmeline, is like a caregiver. She just loves babies and taking care of people. If you like stories that are about family and like typical life struggles, right? Like overcoming grief, then it's an amazing book for that. I feel like the relationship between the sisters is like complicated and interesting and poignant. It definitely hits a lot of those emotional notes that like an Anne Patchett book or a Jennifer Egan book does, if you like those authors. It was one of my favorites because I could relate to both the older sisters. There's this one quote after she gives birth where she holds her baby and she's like, she describes it as feeling all of a sudden like incredibly powerful. She just felt like she knew exactly what she needed to do and she was the one who was going to take care of this baby and the path was clear to her and she just needed herself. To me, it was like such a powerful image. I've never heard of motherhood described that way. Like, yeah, they describe the childbirth process, like her screaming, it being painful, but then like the immense power, I think, that comes with that. I feel like that scene is usually described as like a very tender maternal moment, but I think in this book it was described as just like her cells fundamentally shifting and becoming this new woman.
Yeah, that sounds like such a sweet, emotional book. And I love books that reframe motherhood in this way, because I feel like a lot of times, like the literary take on motherhood is like this horror take. It's not about you being a mother. It's about like you as a woman and how you're transforming. I love that.
What's one of your favorites?
Okay, I think this is actually my number 1 pick.
Perfect.
For the year. And it is The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. This was the 2022 National Book Award winner. And I fell in love with this one. It's not for everybody, as I've realized. It only has like a 3.5 star rating on Goodreads. And the writing I found to be just stunning. I think it might be some of the best writing I've ever read in my entire life, but I know a lot of other people found it too dense. But the premise of The Rabbit Hutch, I'll read Storygraph's AI prompt. So Storygraph is a Goodreads competitor, and they have this AI feature that tells you who the book is good for. So this is the little blurb that AI came up with. The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty is a good fit for readers interested in exploring the complexities of human relationships, the struggle for transcendence, and the desire for love and connection, all set against the backdrop of a decaying Midwestern town. We have a protagonist, Blandine, who's a foster kid, and she's ethereally beautiful. She's fiercely intelligent, and Blandine becomes obsessed with female Christian martyrs. So she becomes increasingly wrapped up in her own inner world with God and the idea of like salvation, but she's not very religious. And this isn't like a religious experience for her. It's like this idea that you can transcend out of the physical and outside of your own body and like reach some sort of divinity. And she's obsessed with this idea. So she is a foster kid, and she's living in this really rundown Midwestern town called Vacaville, Indiana. And she starts living with these 3 other boys. And in the first few pages of the book, we realize that they've committed some horrendous act of violence against her. And we don't really know what it is, but we just know it was shocking, graphic, gruesome. And throughout the entire book, we put together the pieces of what the boys did to Blandine and all of the characters in the apartment complex who kind of come together in the narrative and played their own small part in this act of violence. So I thought it was mysterious, but deeply, deeply emotional. And some of the broader themes of the book are like the old Midwestern industrial towns and how they're crumbling and like all the people that crumble with it, how everybody's living these complex inner lives. And we don't look at each other as people. Sometimes we just see each other as strangers and pass each other in the hallway and don't like talk to each other. But once we see each other as human, we can like reach this new level of neighborness that like can rise above the crumbling industrial complex around us. And I thought that was like super beautiful. So have you heard of this book?
I have, yeah. It's been on my list for a while.
I read it alongside a podcast. So there's this podcast that I love called Book Talk Podcast. They read a book and then they do a podcast episode 1/4 of the way, like 4 times throughout the course of reading the book. And so when I would get like 25% of the way through, I would listen to this episode and hear what they had to say about it. And I felt like it really enriched my own reading experience. So highly recommend doing that when you read. But this one also hit home personally for me because the author, Tess Gunty, went to Notre Dame, and that's my alma mater. She was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, and Vacaville is based off of South Bend, where Notre Dame is.
Could you tell? Did you know that? Or like, could you tell that just from reading the book?
I could tell by reading the book, but also I did know that going into it because I had gotten a notification from the university, like in our alumni emails, that she had won the National Book Award. And so like I was waiting for it to come out.
They were like, please, we want to claim this as our own.
No, literally. And it's interesting because like Notre Dame isn't known for like the arts. Yeah. It has a good business school and it's like not a humanities driven university. And she talks a lot about how the creative writing program at Notre Dame actually let her be very experimental and weird, and how it has a very not well known yet very cool creative writing program.
Oh, amazing. I can't wait to read it.
I loved it.
Also, this pick of yours, I feel like leads nicely into my next pick because I mean, we have like similar taste, but my next pick is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. I'm a really big fan of James McBride. I've read like everything he's written. How I got exposed to him was because he was on Obama's favorites list for Deacon King Kong. And I read that book and it was my favorite book for a long time. So when this book came out this year, I was like, must read. And I feel like people who are into people watching are into maybe these kinds of books because the whole magic of people watching is you see like a normal person and you just like judge them based on what they're wearing and how they're acting, and you create like an inner life for them. It's all about the like complex inner lives of characters, right? His characters are all like diverse from like a race perspective, as well as a socioeconomic class perspective, as well as a religion perspective. The thing that makes his characters so special is even though there's all of these differences in these communities that he highlights, like Deacon King Kong is set in 1960s, 1970s New York City. And then The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store is set in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. And it's this neighborhood called Chicken Hill, where there's all of these Jewish immigrants, Black migrants from the South, a bunch of other immigrant populations that are replacing one another, and white flight, and like all of these complex social changes. You have all of these characters who on the surface are so different, who have a lot of prejudice against one another. But then throughout the course of the book, it's just so clear what makes everybody human and like what ties us together.
He must be incredibly emotionally intelligent and empathetic.
Yeah, well, he's a jazz musician. Which maybe this is a reach, but I feel like his books have like musicality for sure. Like his dialogue, his pace, it feels so organic in a way that I think improvisation and like jazz specifically, because so much of it is improv and you don't practice for, you just have to like wing it on the spot. There's like a nice parallel there. There was this New York Times review and they put it in this really amazing way. They called it a murder mystery inside a great American novel. We open where there's this skeleton at the bottom of a well. You don't know who's dead or who killed that person. Clearly, there's some suspicious circumstances around why there's a skeleton at the bottom of the well. And then you're taken back into time, dropped in the middle of Chicken Hill, this neighborhood, and introduced to 8 to 10 different characters. And then by the end, it all ties together. I think you know what you're getting yourself into in that this book is about this community coming together. But I think it's also about what's unknowable. You have this character, Dodo, who is deaf because of an accident when he was younger. And so much of his storyline is only available to the reader because he can't communicate 100% clearly with the people around him.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
As a reader to go through that. It does sound very similar to The Rabbit Hutch, and where you're getting different slices of humanity centered around the same setting or
exactly.
the same place, and you experience it differently through each person. I love that so much.
What's another pick of yours?
Okay, this is going in a little bit of a different direction, but my second favorite book of this year was I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai. This is my first Rebecca Makkai. She rose to notoriety with The Great Believers, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Storygraph's AI says, I Have Some Questions for You is a good fit for those seeking a thought-provoking and suspenseful mystery that delves into the themes of justice, true crime, and the complexities of human relationships. The protagonist is Bodie Kane. She is a woman in her 40s. She went to a prestigious New England boarding school, and when she was there, her roommate was murdered. And she is now a true crime podcaster, and she is invited back to the boarding school to teach a class on journalism. Her students are making podcasts themselves, and one of the students decides that they want to delve into the murder of her roommate. And so he's doing investigative journalism, and Bodie is struggling with the fact that she doesn't really want to delve into this because there was a man, Omar, and he was incarcerated for the murder of the roommate. And she's always kind of felt like there was something fishy about the entire situation, but she had no proof. And at the same time, it was oh, this is all in the past, and I don't really need to dig too far into it. Obviously, she does dig into it. That is the entire book, is her students uncovering these sort of forgotten plot points and asking her a bunch of questions that she never wanted to ask herself. As she's remembering everything that happened, she realizes that her memories are incredibly fallible. And so one of the major themes is the fallibility of memory, how we give ourselves a narrative and give everyone around us a narrative as well. And then that's not accurate to what's happening in reality. And so it's a real exploration of that. It's also an exploration of true crime culture and specifically true crime podcasting. So how we sort of have this voyeuristic interest and sort of fetishize these young women who are murdered and killed. And we don't see them as victims. We see them as a story.
Yeah.
And these are real people. There's also a lot of talk of feminist themes, Bodie's ex-husband is under fire. He's a professor and he's having an affair with a 20-something-year-old young woman. And she's claiming that he used his privilege and power over her to entice her into this relationship. And she is calling it abuse. And so there's this whole conversation around how should we look at these relationships where there is power dynamics at play? Are we infantilizing women when we say that they aren't complicit in these power dynamics? Or do we need to say that men have more of a role because they are older and do have more power? So I think she explored that so well in a way that really showed both sides of the issue and had something to say. She didn't shy away from actually having a stance on it. I found this one to be an excellent mystery, an excellent literary novel, and also one that truly made me think and changed my outlook both on true crime and some of these feminist power dynamic themes. So that's why I made my list.
Yeah, amazing. I actually I listened to this book as an audiobook. So as you're talking about this, I'm oh yeah, it's bringing back all of the things. I feel the way you described it was beautiful because I hear what you're saying. I feel she did have a really nuanced, impressive take on these difficult issues where there's not a clear right answer. But it was also just very entertaining. When I listened to it as an audiobook, I felt like I was listening to an actual true crime podcast.
And I have such a newfound appreciation this year for books that can be both literary and entertaining. I've read some really bizarre books this year. And I did it because I knew that the writing was cool and maybe they had a cool premise. But then I'm you're not even considering whether or not I'm entertained right now. You're just taking my attention for granted. And I hate that. So I think what the 3 books that I chose have in common is not only are they beautiful and literary, but they want to entertain you.
Yeah, that's so interesting because this question of entertainment value, one book I put on my honorable mentions list It didn't make it into my top 3 because I guess I didn't feel it was literary enough, but I also listened to this as an audiobook and I loved it. Like, it made me cry. The book Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. Have you heard of this
book? It's been on my list forever.
Yeah, I mean, I really
yeah.
highly recommend listening to it as an audiobook. The audiobook was just so well done. It's about an elderly woman who cleans the aquarium at night and the relationship she develops with an octopus inside of the aquarium. And the octopus has a voice. He has his own chapters. Love his perspective on observing like all these people and characters walking around outside of his tank. Yeah, I feel like there's not that many books about people later in life. And throughout the novel, you really start to root for her. She's a widow. She's thinking about selling her house that she lived in with her husband. She lost her son to an accident or maybe suicide. It's unresolved. And she's sad. Like, she's thinking about moving to a retirement home. And I found the book very inspiring because various people in the community and strangers and friends come together to kind of reveal that there's still a lot more left to life.
I'll have to listen to it for sure. Oh, okay. I'm excited to hear your honorable mentions at the end, but we're coming up on our last top 3s now. So Lucy, what's your final top 3?
Okay, so my last one is called When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatit. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. It's the only book I've ever read of his, and I read it this year, but it was actually published in 2021. It was on Obama's favorites for that year.
Thanks, Obama.
Yeah. I don't think I went in with any crazy high expectations or anything, but I ended up loving it. Like, it was a book that I read in a day. I just couldn't put it down. The format is a little bit untraditional, so I'll read the Storygraph AI recommendation just to give you a sense, because it's like hard to describe the book, I would say. So When We Cease to Understand the World is a good fit for those interested in exploring the intersection of science, philosophy, and the human experience, particularly in the face of groundbreaking discoveries that challenge our understanding of reality. So I would say if you like magical realism, like in Haruki Murakami, or even Kazuo Ishiguro, I'm a big fan of both those authors. You'll probably like this book. It's like a series of short stories, I guess. And every little section covers either like an amazing scientist or an incredible mathematician who were real people. But fact and fiction is blurred because things that really did happen, like this person discovering a particular mathematical principle, or like Schrodinger is in it, for example, Heisenberg is in it. You're like wondering half the time, like, oh, is this really how it happened? Or is this like, what is real? Because he is telling like the history. I feel like it's a very well-researched book of like how these really geniuses in their field came to these groundbreaking conclusions. But that's mixed with their inner lives and the turmoil that comes with being a genius and the turmoil that comes with reaching some sort of scientific or mathematical breakthrough, how it pushes you to the edge because you are on the edge of discovery, how that can like wreak havoc on your mental health and your emotions. And I feel like it's that question of like, how far is too far? And like, when we are humans and we're just always pushing to reach the edges of possibility and like our full potential, do you run the risk of madness? Wow. And so that's the piece where it's like, I mean, I just don't think there's that much written, frankly, about some of the characters that he covers who are real people in terms of like what was going on inside their brains. So I'm sure that was his literary choice to like depict them in a certain way, but it just becomes fascinating.
So is he playing on real events of their lives to paint this picture of their internal world, or is it completely fictionalized?
There's definitely things that happened, but perhaps there's not. Like there's a scene, for example, where one of the scientists is like in a sanatorium for his health. Like this was back in the days where people got tuberculosis and had to go to like sanatoriums to like recover. I think that was an actual thing that happened in his life. But then in the sanatorium, definitely there's aspects of magical realism. The setting is not quite real. There's characters in the sanatorium that are like ghostly. But again, you don't know how much is like, because he's also kind of losing his mind. How much is reality versus his perception versus historical fact versus author creating fiction?
That is so interesting. I've never even heard of or read a book like that before that blurs the line of fiction and nonfiction stories.
Yeah, no, totally. There's this amazing quote that I'll read that I think really captures it. And it's about this mathematician named Schwarzschild, who he was the first to come up with an exact solution to Einstein's field equations in his theory of general relativity. He came up with the Schwarzschild singularity, which is critical to how we think about black holes. But the quote is, "If matter were prone to birthing monsters of this kind," Schwarzschild asked with a trembling voice, "were there correlations with the human psyche? Could a sufficient concentration of human will, millions of people exploited for a single end with their minds compressed into the same psychic space, unleash something comparable to the singularity.
Okay, I feel like I just had an aneurysm listening to you say that. I have no idea what that means. I feel like I didn't understand the words, but like I think I understand the meaning. It's like far out topics that these people are exploring that it almost induces a sort of psychosis in them.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
And-
I'm not very like scientifically minded, right? But like I don't think that's like a barrier for this book. They're fundamental questions of, again, what is the meaning of life? Why do we want what we want? And it's so interesting to see that applied to a field where I feel like growing up, math and science always seemed to have right answers. Like there was a correct answer to an equation. But when you get to the edges of these fields, things are very blurry. There's like no right answers. People are just laboring for years and years to figure out one thing that could be disproven or not. And like it's completely theoretical. And so I thought it was a really interesting take on these fields that, for me at least, really like flipped it on its head. Where I was like, wow, yeah, if you're like theorizing at the edges of known reality, it would make you question not only like, because we're talking about like with physics, actual matter, like physical things, right? You would think that there's concreteness with this, but then it melds with the world of philosophy. If matter can behave in ways that defy human imagination, then what could the human mind achieve?
Okay, I'm going to have to read this one because this has a connection to something that I'm actually looking at in my life right now. But I've been very interested in old school science, not old school as in like the 20s. I'm talking about like 1300 here and like alchemists, like pre-chemists and their relation to secret societies and like the Freemasons and stuff. So very woo-woo, but
because of the book you're writing, right?
Yeah. I'm writing a dark academia, so I have to look into all this stuff, but I've naturally been very interested for a long time. What I've found incredibly interesting is a lot of the themes that you're talking about are things that are like well known in the Western esoteric tradition. And we're just picking apart things and like coming to conclusions that people have come to in the ancient world. Now it's almost like these scientific discoveries are just validating what we've already known. And like kind of that quote that you just read, where it's basically describing like almost this hive mind of humanity centering in on a singularity. And now we're going to like discover the singularity through technology or science, the philosophical world being mirrored in the scientific and the mathematical world. I think that's so fascinating. So I'm definitely gonna have to read this one.
Amazing. I feel like this is a good transition into your last pick, which is also very like, well, I haven't read the whole thing, but I feel like it's like a cerebral book.
Yes. My last pick is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. And this book was published in 2021. It was a National Book Award finalist. And Anthony Doerr is the author of All the Light We Cannot See. But there's only usually like 2 or 3 books that make me cry a year. All the Light We Cannot See did last year, and Cloud Cuckoo Land did this year.
Oh, wow. So you're a big fan of him, Anthony Doerr.
I am. I've also listened to some of his interviews on like podcasts and some of his lectures, and he just seems like such a sweet, kind-hearted man. I'm a big Anthony Doerr fan. All right, so this book is one of the rare books that has found commercial success and is like widely adored, but is also highly literary, and I love that. It has a 4.26 star rating on Goodreads, which is very
so high
with 200,000 reviews,
Wow.
which is also quite high. So Storygraph AI says Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr is a good fit for people who are interested in stories that explore the power of hope, resilience, and the interconnectedness of humanity across time and space. And I think that is the perfect summary of this book. But essentially, the plot itself centers around 4 or 5 different perspectives. And you switch perspectives each chapter, and the chapters are quite short, which I really liked. I feel like that helps you move through a book really quickly and keeps you engaged. And I found out that he writes that way because All the Light We Cannot See is written that way too. He writes that way because he's a father, so he doesn't have that much time to sit down and like write a full scene. So he's constantly being interrupted. And he said, I don't do it on purpose. I think it's just like a function of my life, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, but it also makes it easy if you're like a busy person, just like, okay, one more chapter. It's a very easy one more chapter book. Cloud Cuckoo Land opens with a very heartfelt dedication to all of the libraries and librarians of the world. And it is supposed to be an ode to all the book lovers and the power of knowledge in books through time. And that is really what this book is about. So there is an ancient text from Greece called Cloud Cuckoo Land. And it's the story of Atheon, who's kind of this, we'll call him a goofball, and he wants to turn into a bird so that he can fly up to this utopian paradise in the sky that everyone tells him is not real. But he thinks it's real, so he goes on this long journey. And we don't really know the whole plot of the book because in modern day, so many pieces of it have been lost. So at the beginning of each section, we just like read a little bit of Cloud Cuckoo Land. And then we find out as we're moving through the different perspectives of the story that each character has a vital role to play in the preservation of Cloud Cuckoo Land from ancient times to modern day. And so the furthest in the past perspective is from 1453 during the fall of Constantinople. And then it goes all the way into the near future, into 2161, where there's a girl who's discovering Cloud Cuckoo Land as well. So it's really beautiful and like talking about how easy it is for a book to be lost to time and all of the heroic acts that had to be performed to keep this book alive for that girl in 2161 to be able to read it. And all of the perspectives, when they read the book, it fundamentally alters them as people and like gives them hope and a sense of humanity that they wouldn't have otherwise had. You can just watch it change their life. So I loved that so much. Like as somebody who loves books and storytelling, and especially like the way that storytelling makes us more human, it felt so profound to me. It's one that made me cry at the end because it was just that. It was just like profound. Like nothing like happened at the end that I was like, oh, I'm going to cry now. But it was just like, as a whole, I was awestruck, like in the literal sense of the word, just like awestruck by this story. And it reminds me of a Kazuo Ishiguro quote, which I also love him. Never Let Me Go was one of my favorite books. And he, in his Noble Acceptance speech, he has one of my favorite quotes about storytelling ever, which is, but in the end, stories are about one person saying to another, this is the way it feels to me. Can you understand what I'm saying? Is this the way it feels to you?
Oh, so
sweet.
Amazing. Yeah.
So that is Cloud Cuckoo Land. Highly recommend.
Dude, I feel like we should just end this show there on that quote. I feel like that's what this podcasting experience is like too.
Yeah.
Like sharing our stories, screaming into the void. Like, is there anyone else who feels similarly?
I just got chills. That was profound.
Okay, I'll just edit this to be the closing.
Amazing. Well, I do want to hear your honorable mentions. Like, how did you pick your honorable mentions and like, why didn't they make your top 3? Are these like a completely different criteria? Tell me about it.
I mean, top 3, it was tough. I gotta say, like, you know, I feel like a lot of people do like top 10, top 20. And I feel like the fact that we did top 3 really forced me to think critically about which would make it. So the other, I've got 4. One I already talked about, Remarkably Bright Creatures. The next one is Foster by Claire Keegan. The vibes are To Kill a Mockingbird vibes. The main character is a female child narrator and the people that she encounters. I think that's why it gives me Scout vibes for sure. If books can tell the perspective of a child or like the loss of innocence, well, I feel like that's always like a winner for me. It's always very emotional.
Yeah, it's always impressive when they can pull that off too.
Very good. I think had it been a meatier or longer novel, it probably would have made my top 3. But since it was so short, I mean, it was an amazing like little snack. Like I definitely felt a lot of emotions, but I think it was just too short to have the complexity that some of my top 3 picks did. What about one of yours?
All right, so my list is books that I was incredibly entertained by. I can't rate a book highly if it doesn't have good writing, so by default, all of these are very well written. The storytelling power in them is so strong. There was staying power with all of these, but they just didn't make me cry. It was more like I had fun with these. So 2 of my top honorable mentions are The Guest by Emma Cline. This was considered like the cool girl book of the summer.
I've seen
and
this.
Totally agree. Yeah. Alex is, I think she's like 19 and she is in the Hamptons and she's running away from somebody in the city. And we don't really know why, but she's like completely fucking unhinged. And she like has no money. She gets kicked out of her sugar daddy's mansion in the Hamptons. And she's like, well, I'm not going back to New York, so I'm just gonna have to figure it out here. And she basically cons her way into like sleeping in mansions and like figuring out where she's going to get her next meal. And we follow her over the course of, I want to say a week. She is fundamentally insane, but I just had such a good time with her. I never knew what was going to happen next. And like I had anxiety in a fun way the entire time. Another one that kind of made me feel that way was Big Swiss by Jen Began. This was just a lot of fun. It was so well written. I was laughing out loud, but it also was profound in the end. So I think like most people know the premise of this one. It's a sex therapist transcriptionist. She falls in love with a woman in the transcriptions who's getting therapy at the sex therapist. And she ends up meeting her in real life and they have this affair. And yeah, the main character is like obviously unhinged. Like that entire storyline is just fundamentally unhinged. But it was profound because it actually deals with a lot of themes of how we let trauma affect us and if we are able to overcome it or not. And like the main character knows all the traumas of her lover, obviously, because she's listening to her therapy sessions and she like lets her own traumas trample her. So they're like learning from each other and it's all about like weakness and strength and what it means to like actually be strong in the face of adversity. And I thought it was great, but also like very funny. So that was number 2. All right, what are your last 2?
All This Could Be Different a debut novel by Sarah Thankum Matthews. Actually, I discovered this book because I was just in a reading in Crown Heights and she read. I think there was like 5 or 6 different authors. They all read little excerpts and I was blown away by her reading. It's like a very funny, entertaining book. At parts, hard to get through because it was just too real. Like, it tells the story of a recent college grad, first-generation immigrant, semi-estranged from her family. She's got her first job out of college, which is this consulting job in the Midwest, and her experiences living alone and dating as a lesbian and just like typical first job struggles and like the unfairness of life, and then also dealing with her own trauma that she's experienced in her life. The humor is very dry, and when she was reading it herself, it was funny. Like, it's hard to make a room of people laugh, and she was able to do that.
It was a National Book Award finalist.
Incredible for that to be her like first book. And
yeah, I actually just got this book in a PR packet, my very first
oh my
book
God, you
PR
get
package.
PR packages. What? Who are you?
I've gotten a few physical ARCs, which are advanced reader copies, but I got my very first PR package from Penguin Random House. Thank you, Penguin. This was one of the books that was in it, so I'm definitely reading it soon.
Amazing. And then my last pick is this book called A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. It's kind of similar to Hello Beautiful vibes in that it's about this close-knit family and then events happen that send them along different paths and kind of tear them apart. And it's a question of how do they come back together? Will they? And the story, it's this Muslim American family, and there's a Romeo and Juliet love story at the center of it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to put this one on my list because I love when we get stories like that written from the perspective, like the author is part of that culture. Like, we're not getting it secondhand. All right, my last 2 picks are not nearly as deep and profound, but we have my favorite romance book ever. And I don't really read romance. This is You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke Emezi. Have you heard this?
No.
Okay, so Akwaeke Emezi is an award-winning novelist. They are just an incredible writer, but they were interested in making romance, I guess, like a more serious genre. And they were like pissed off basically that romance wasn't taken seriously in the literary world. And so they wrote You Make a Fool of Death with Your Beauty through the lens of the literary novel that would be chosen for like a book award. And it is so entertaining. It's spicy, like literary spice. Had no idea this was a thing.
Yeah.
Like, this is the first time I've ever read it. I was like, this is fantastic. It was also like laugh out loud funny, just like Big Swiss was to me. But yeah, I highly, highly recommend, especially if you're not really a romance reader, but you like want to
I'm definitely going to read
experience it in a way.
I'm adding it right now.
It was good.
On my Libby.
Oh, fantastic. My last one is kind of an under the radar one. I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. So you might be able to get it from Libby pretty quickly. It's called Exalted by Anna Dorn. And this was my very first read of 2023, and I had so much fun with it. It has the craziest plot twist I've ever read in a book.
You were surprised,
but
genuinely?
Genuinely.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah.
Also down my alley. I love being surprised.
Yeah. You would like this. It is super well written, but deals with vapid topics, and I love that interplay. So we're following like a young influencer in LA. She is depressed, has all these mental health problems, but she's an astrologer, like one of these like pop culture astrologer people. And she basically reads people's charts and like that's how she's funding her life. She gets paid to do a reading for somebody and she's like, oh my God, this is the most perfect star chart I've ever seen in my life. Every planet he has is in its like, exalted position. And so she becomes absolutely obsessed with him. She wants to date him. She like finagles her way into his life.
Kind of like Big Swiss vibes.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. But like the tone is so different. It's not like laugh out loud funny, but you're just like, what the fuck the entire time? And the other perspective is of this unhinged middle-aged woman who she like divorced her husband and married a woman and she's like going through a mental health crisis. And it's the mother of the guy that she got the star reading for. So like we're kind of like seeing him from 2 perspectives. All of their lives clash. It is so much fun. Yeah, highly recommend.
Cool.
All right. Well, this was such a fun episode, Lucy.
Yeah, no, it was. I love this. I feel like we should do this every month.
Yeah, we absolutely should. And definitely check out our Patreon for the info on our book club. It'll be a fun time. So I'm really excited to like continue this conversation.
Thanks for listening.
Bye, guys.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.